The late Ralph Fields was one of the early pioneers in cactus collecting here in Australia. The significance of his contribution to cacti is highlighted when you consider that anyone with a sizable collection of cacti in Australia will have plants that had their origins in Ralph's original collection. The story of Ralph's passion for cacti is told here by his son Robert.
As you can probably well see from a garden like this, it covers about 2.5 acres. And it got to the stage where we had a little over 2,000 different varieties just of cactus alone in the collection. Well, the origin of this collection started with my father as a very young boy. His father had a common prickly pear and he had a little pink zygo cactus. And Dad picked up a copy of the boy's own paper, which was an 1896 volume at that time, and in those days it was produced annually. And in there was an article on how to graft a zygo cactus into an opuntia. Being an English magazine, it went through all the detail on how to do it. So Dad, as a 12-year-old, got pretty excited about this and did the little experiment. Hadn't told anyone about it, didn't tell his parents. He just did it and was successful. That excited him. Ultimately, he saw a different coloured zygo cactus growing in another garden somewhere in Kew in Melbourne, and he managed to badger a little piece of that, and he grafted that as well, and it grew well. So he had the two growing on the one plate of opuntia. So his parents, of course, fostered this interest in a boy wanting to do something practical like this. An arrangement was made with the Botanic Gardens. He could go and have a look at the Botanic Gardens, and he got talking to the curator of that particular area where a small collection of probably 20 or 30 plants were growing at the time. And this would be about 1900 and 1908. So it's going back a long way. And Dad was offered then access to any plants that he would like if someone would come in and pick them up. So Dad teed up an uncle at that time who took a benchtop wagon to the Botanic Gardens on a Christmas day, and with the curator, and of course Christmas Day meant nothing as far as a little boy with a very keen hobby went. And anyway, between the curator and Dad, they gathered up about 30 different cuttings that Dad had his eyes on, that he liked the look of, and took them home. And of course he then planted them out 2 weeks later in the soil, and of course so many of them grew on wonderfully well in Kew that inspired Dad to find out more and more about cactus. So off then to the Melbourne Library to look for knowledge of any cactus books. And at that time there was only one book written in English on how to grow them. It was an English book. To save 2 shillings in those days took a fair bit of work to achieve that, because the only access to plants was not in the corner shops. There was no such thing as Bunnings or Coles or Woolworths or anything like that. So Dad would then write letters and get catalogues from England and Germany and America. And in that saving of 2 shillings, which ultimately grew to 5 or whatever, he'd have enough then to write away and ask for 6 plants or something, and little collections. And quite a lot of those old catalogues I've still got here, which is so fascinating to look at. He went away to the First World War, and when he came back his parents had moved from Kew to Hawthorn, but they moved Dad's little collection of cactus with them, and Dad was still inspired about cactus even after coming back from the brutality of the First World War. Ultimately in 1927 he came up to Tennyson in northern Victoria to be a wheat farmer. They were bad years, they were depression years, and the more wheat he grew the more money he lost. But the cactus kept him going. So he was 10 years on his own here working before he got married, and that was 1935 when he got married. But in that time the cactus collection had grown to quite some extent, and a lot of the plants had done wonderfully well up here. But he was coming up here from Melbourne into the unknown, and he got a few shocks. A few plants that were growing well in Melbourne, when they got up here they turned up their toes. They couldn't stand the extreme heat or the severity of the cold, and so he lost a few of those, but it wasn't enough to dampen his spirits very much. In 1935, despite getting married, he was offered a share in a German expedition which went to South America looking for cactus. Dad again couldn't afford it, but the incentive was there. There was a guarantee of over 1,000 plants to anyone who subscribed to that expedition. And that was really a good carrot in front of the donkey's nose. But he managed to get a nurseryman in Melbourne by the name of George Hodgins, who was a bit interested in a few cactus, but he was more of a general nurseryman. They had their nursery in Essendon. And my mother and Dad used to make up miniature gardens and sell some of their excess plants through the nursery in Melbourne. And as a result, Mr. Hodgins helped finance Dad into this full share, which cost £100 in those days, in this expedition. The expedition covered about 6,000 kilometres over a period of 2 years, and so a lot of discoveries in that time. 12 shares were sold. He'd bought the only Australian share that was sold. But when plants would arrive, they'd come by ship, and sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 months out of Sewell before they get here to Melbourne. There were no quarantine restrictions. He would just go down and meet the ship and bring home his boxes full of plants and get them re-established here. And many of them had shrunk a fair bit because they'd gone a long time without a drink. But once they filled up again, root development, they went ahead, and many of them are still growing and thriving in the garden. We've lost some, obviously, but many of them are doing wonderfully well. So that gave the collection a great foundation, which we've built on over the many, many years. Overall, most of our plants thrive under the severe conditions we've got here, and I think it is really the extremes of both heat and cold and the maximum and minimum temperatures created in one day that accentuates spine and wool development on certain plants. There's only me and my shadow these days looking after the garden. The shadow's been pretty lazy, and that dictates sort of how much work gets done in a day or in a week on end, but there's too many distractions. We're still trying to run a farm as well. With irrigation, there's 350 acres of farm, so it continues on, but as to how long I don't know.